Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is David Fitzgerald. I co-direct the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies. There's obviously been a lot of talk this past week about immigration reform, and today we're going to be looking at some historical lessons about that theme. We're going to be talking about the new book, Unwanted, Italian and Jewish Mobilization Against Restrictive Immigration Laws, 1882 to 1965, from the University of North Carolina Press. We're honored to have with us the author, Maddalena Marinari. She is Associate Professor of History at Gustavus Adolphus College and a leading scholar of US immigration policymaking history. Our discussant today is Roger Waldinger. He is the director of the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA, which is the co-host of today's event, as well as all of our online programming this academic year. Please note that our next event is going to be next Friday, the second in our Emerging Scholars Workshops. This time we'll be talking about the topic of asylum. You can find information about those events and all of our other events at the websites of both of our centers. The order of business today is we're first going to hear a 20-minute overview of the book by Professor Marinari. We'll have a 10-minute comment from Professor Waldinger. She'll give a brief response, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. At any time, you're welcome to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, make comments, and I will collate and moderate that discussion following her response. So without further ado, welcome to California, Maddalena. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen because I have a short presentation that I prepared. Okay, so thank you again for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here because it's more or less the year that my book came out. So it's particularly exciting to be able to be here and celebrate the first year anniversary, even though we're in the midst of a pandemic. I hope you're all doing well. I wanted to take a moment very briefly to talk about the origin of this project and share why this event is dear and near to my heart. So the idea behind Unwanted actually came during a workshop at UCLA where I had the pleasure of meeting both Roger and David. So these many years later, thank you again. So at the time, I remember we were discussing, a lot of the presentations were about restriction along the border, and a lot of people were talking about rethinking the periodization of immigration history, and a lot of people were talking about May 9th's book, Impossible Subject. And so even though I'd actually, if there are any PhD students in the audience, I'm sorry, I actually just defended my prospectus. I left with a completely different idea for my dissertation that then became this book. So I noticed essentially that even though there was a very rich literature on restriction targeting Chinese immigrants, for example, no one had really written about European immigrants. And so I decided to look at that. I wanted to know, well, we know something about their mobilization again, for the 1965 Immigration Act. No one had looked at it historically. So I wanted to know, did they do something? What did they do? And I also was curious to learn whether or not they had worked with other activists, essentially. It turns out that they did, but it wasn't always easy. I was also curious to see if their immigrant experience had any connection to how they mobilized. And so before we go any further, I thought I would mention very briefly, so why did I choose Italian and Jewish immigrants? In part because they were the primary target of the Immigration Quota Act, which is about to celebrate its 100th anniversary in a few months. And it's really because they were seen as beyond Chinese immigrants as the least desirable migrants, in part because they were coming to the United States in large numbers, but also because they were seen as radically different than immigrants from Northern and Southern Europe. As you can see here, almost immediately, they were seen as racially dubious, morally inferior, and almost impossible to integrate. But the other reason is because these two groups also had two very different immigrant experience, right? So Italians arrived originally in a small group, mostly male. They had a profound attachment to Italy. They went back and forth. They delayed as much and as long as possible their naturalization. Jewish activists usually didn't have a strong connection to where they were coming from. And they tended to move in families and naturalize as quickly as possible. At the organizational level, there was also another difference. Even though I think it's safe to say that it was an uneasy alliance for Eastern European Jews, the fact that there was already a German Jewish cohort that was well established and well connected, it turns out made a big difference in terms of their activism. So much so that by the 1920s, the immigration problem is all of a sudden called the Jewish problem, precisely because they're so visible and active. Italians, on the other hand, have to build any kind of a network and organization from scratch. And they also have to deal with the constant interference, essentially, of the Italian government. And so you have, right, one group, the Italian, who is blamed for having these strong ties to their motherland and not naturalizing enough. And you have another group that is criticized for naturalizing too quickly and being a little bit too involved in the political sphere. So my book is essentially divided into two sections, and they both revolve around the role that war has in US history and in immigration policy of the war, essentially. And World War I really becomes a pivotal moment. But in the first three chapters, essentially, I cover from the moment these immigrants arrive in 1882 to slightly before the beginning of World War II. And really, I look at three things, right? So what did these groups do to push back against immigration? And you get a sense that once they finally realized that they were indeed the target of restrictive immigration policy, they created an they each created an organization to specifically fight for immigration reform. But they also had to contend with how they had to decide, right, how to push for it. And this was happening at a time where the way legislation was happening was changing. So you have the shift to committees, but you also have a sudden interest in immigration policy by, for example, Southern politicians. And so the first chapter looks at, for example, how even though there was a strong commitment to doing something about these European immigrants, it's really not until World War I that a lot of legislators decide that they have to come to terms with restricting white European immigrants as well. The second one really traces essentially the realization on the part of both groups that more restriction is coming. So one of the first arguments, which you hear today as well, right? It's like, what we have is restrictive enough. Why do we want to take it further? But when they realize that more restriction is coming, then this is when the activists start trying things that, looking for things that might be places to negotiate. And there are two that start emerging, and they will solidify even more after World War II, which is family reunion and skills. And then chapter 3 kind of looks at what happens once these laws have happened. And I want to emphasize that unlike today, where there's the system and the bureaucracy are fairly set, 100 years ago, there are all these restrictive measures, laws, but it's never quite clear how what the implementation is. And so as I'll explain in a moment. Let me quickly. So World War I is pivotal. I realized today that Prescott Hall looks a little bit like Stephen Miller, sorry. But so World War I emerges as a critical, pivotal moment to push for restriction against Europeans, right? And you get a sense here of the segregation on a large scale that the Immigration Restriction League that Prescott Hall believed to really push for. And there are really broad coalitions that start emerging. So you have Western politicians who have been fighting for Chinese restriction for decades. You have politicians from the East Coast who have been mobilizing for decades and are quite frustrated that not more is happening against these groups. But then you also have Southern politicians who all of a sudden realize that immigration policy becomes a way for them to retain power and influence, even though they represent areas that have very few immigrants. So this is how you get then to 1924, which according to Johnson, one of the sponsors of the law, is a second declaration of independence. And so the tricky thing about both 21 and 24, the quota, so the quota is essentially the 1924 Immigration Act imposes a near ban on immigration from Asia and creates these quotas that heavily penalize immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and favor immigrants from Western and Northern Europe in the name of protecting the American race, so to speak, the superior American race. Because much of these laws are actually difficult to implement in terms of personnel, and because the infrastructure is already unfolding, one of the immediate consequences of enacting both the 1921 and 1924 acts is actually family separation. So there are people who get turned away because all of a sudden the new law applies to them. But out of a moment of crisis emerges a moment of opportunity, because essentially both Jewish and Italian activists realize that family reunion is really the only issue around which legislators will at least try to negotiate, right? And so in the 1930s, despite the Great Depression, because of this pressure on family reunion, the numbers of immigrants coming into the country slowly goes up, and most of that is actually happening through family reunion. But they also have to be pragmatic. So one of the things that I try to do in this book is to show how even groups that are fighting for better, more humane immigration reform sometimes participate in making the system harsher for other groups. So one of the things that pretty soon these two groups realize is that while they can fight and move the needle when it comes to family reunion, they have to give up another one of their original goals, which was to push for an immigration policy that actually accepted quote unquote unskilled immigrants, because they quickly realized that that is just an issue that legislators are not interested in. So if World War I was the moment where restriction happened and allowed for new qualitative but also quantitative restriction, World War II has the opposite effect, and it opens possibilities essentially to negotiate and perhaps make at least some effort to reform a racist and draconian immigration system in place. And this is where you see a divide between, as you can see in the from the quote, between Americans who still strongly believe that the United States has to be isolationist and restrictionist, and politicians, even restrictionist one, who understand that immigration policy has foreign policy implications that now that the role of the US has changed need to take into account. Even someone as problematic as McCarran, who passed the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952. He too understood that some reform had to happen in order to keep some of these alliances going. And so World War II becomes a time where these groups can fight for more legislation, first for refugees, but also for an expansion of these family reunion provisions. And so, and this is essentially what I cover in the second half of the book. What's interesting about what happens in 52 is that it's really the first time that Italians and Jews come together. They've been quite skeptical of any collaboration. You have Jewish activists constantly pushing for collaboration, but Italians are very pragmatic. They only ally with other groups when it affects Italian immigration. But in 52, you have a much broader coalition, which is very racially, ethnically, religiously, socially diverse. And it seems that there's an opportunity for, I'm sure that the sociologists in the room hate this term, for an overhaul of immigration policy. But because of the climate, but also the power of some of the politicians that controlled the Senate, like McCarran. McCarran had an incredible power. He managed to reaffirm the quota system. And even by eliminating the racial requirements of the law, is still only assigned a quota of 100 to most Asian countries. But McCarran also successfully essentially played up the ideological divisions across these groups. And so the 50s go from a moment of, they start off with the victories, hope, and they end with a lot of frustration and disappointment, but also a shift. Essentially, before 1965, 52 is really the last time where these activists propose wholesale elimination of the quota system. After losing, essentially, they realized that a piecemeal approach is better than fighting for big systemic reform. And it's in the piecemeal approach that you start seeing some of the inequality that then will be a legacy of well past after 1965. So these small challenges, for example, will allow more immigrants to come in, effectively undermining what McCarran was trying to do. But these changes also overwhelmingly favored immigrants with skills and family reunification, right? So these laws, essentially, the immigration laws become tools of social engineering, right? And this is happening at a time when there is the racialization of immigrants of color, when the composition of immigration is changing, and most of them are coming from outside of Europe. And then you have 1965, which is, right, usually presented in the literature as a triumph for the groups I study, but by looking at the sources, actually, you can see that they were much more ambivalent about the final product. They were also not as involved as perhaps they had hoped. So on one hand, the passage of 1965 shows the success of doing these massive educational campaigns to get Americans on board with immigration reform, doing these massive initiatives to keep immigration reform at the forefront, both in American society and in Congress. But they're also completely shut out of the negotiation process. And because LBJ himself was quite ambivalent about taking on immigration reform, then you have a system that on one hand eliminated the national origins quota system, but still had quotas. And it also, for the first time, extended quotas to the Western Hemisphere, creating, on one hand, a society that was much more diverse than it had ever been, but also creating the other issue that we constantly talk about when it comes to immigration today, which is a spike in illegal immigration. I think I'm all out of time. Hopefully that was exactly 20 minutes. I lost track of time, so I apologize.
No, no apologies needed. You were exactly on time. Thank you for your discipline. And Roger.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Thanks, Maddalena, for that terrific presentation. I'm delighted to be able to comment on this book. I do very vividly recall that earlier encounter with Maddalena now many years ago. And of course, I've also followed her scholarship very closely. So was delighted when I received an announcement about a year ago that the book had appeared. So let me begin. Within 1 week of taking office, Donald Trump made good on his promise to implement the total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. Issued almost 4 years ago this week, Trump's executive order immediately prohibited the entry of immigrant and non-immigrant citizens from 7 predominantly Muslim countries for 90 days. It barred all refugee resettlement for 100 days, and it indefinitely barred the arrival of Syrian refugees. Now, protests immediately ensued. Immigrants' rights organizations and their allies rallied at airports, and attorneys offered pro bono services to detained arrivals. Simultaneously, more than 1,000 Yemeni store owners in New York struck in solidarity, shutting their stores for a day and marching in protest against Trump's order. January 27th, 2017, was the beginning of a dark era in American history and politics, with an assault on immigrants that continued unendingly up until Trump's very last, ever so shameful day. Though faced with a government determined to use every weapon in its extraordinarily powerful arsenal, immigrants and immigrant rights advocates never stopped fighting back. Though the struggle was uneven, the government's cruelty and overreach had a boomerang effect, yielding a public more sympathetic to immigrants and immigrants' rights than it had been when we entered the reign of Donald the Terrible 4 long years ago. Maddalena Marinari's fascinating, beautifully written, and superbly researched books takes us back to another era in American history, one certainly longer, possibly more horrible, and certainly no less horrible than the one we have just experienced. But what strikes me in reading this history is the devastating solitude of the Italian and Jewish immigrants and their descendants at that moment when America concluded that these immigrants and others like them were so undesirable that their kind should no longer be admitted to the United States. To be sure, allies were not totally absent from the scene. Up through the immediate aftermath of World War I, business did see some continuing usefulness in continued access to European immigrant labor. But business then lost interest, as did the majority of progressive intellectuals, for whom restriction offered the promise of accelerated Americanization, and thus, aside from the occasional civil libertarian or social reformer, such as Frances Perkins, who did all she could for refugee admissions during the Roosevelt era, the Italians and Jews were left to fend for their own. When disaster struck, and it did when desperate refugees sought to leave Europe, or when news of the Holocaust reached the United States, there were precious few immigrant rights advocates who clamored that asylum be found. Things were barely better in the aftermath of disaster. To be sure, Jewish leaders did succeed in organizing a front group of non-Jewish notables to lobby in favor of admitting some portion of the roughly 250,000 Central European and Polish refugees who had survived the Holocaust. But with Jews barely comprising 16% of the refugees admitted under the Displaced Persons Act, a quantity overshadowed by the number of Germans entering the US at the same time, this harvest can only be judged as bitter fruit. In retrospect, is there also anything more pathetic than the spectacle of American citizens unwilling to put themselves front and center for fear of engendering precisely the type of reaction imagined in Philip Roth's counterfactual novel, The Plot Against America? And if the United States did grudgingly open its doors to the survivors of the Holocaust, it was far slower in responding to the plight of Italians with few options in a country devastated by 2 years of intense warfare, until lobbying efforts in the mid-1950s finally yielded results. In the years remaining before passage of the Hart-Celler Act, Italians and Jews did succeed in assembling a large, more diverse coalition. Yet until good luck finally favored the reformers in 1965, and Maddalena decisively demonstrates that passage of the Hart-Celler Act could easily have gone the other way, the immigration advocates mainly undertook the labor of an elephant, only to repeatedly give birth to a mouse. Now, Maddalena sees the history of these two groups as providing a window into their experiences of inclusion and exclusion. In doing so, she shifts the angle of vision from the internal to the external, providing a way of seeing that conventional approaches, with their back at the border, inevitably ignore. For example, in their effort to compare the boundaries separating Blacks, Mexicans, and Southern and Eastern Europeans, Sabel Fox and Thomas Guglielmo conclude that there was essentially no boundary between whites on the one hand and Southern and Eastern Europeans on the other. They write, quote, wherever white was a meaningful category, these immigrants and their descendants were almost always included within it, end quote. Now that conclusion might be justified if we assume that the conditions that mattered to Italians, Jews, and other Southern and Eastern European immigrants were entirely contained within the borders of the United States. But if migration scholarship has taught us anything, it is that immigration pulls networks of peoples and communities across state borders. The selectivity of migration inevitably creates internationalized families, as those most likely to move and benefit from leaving do so first, putting down roots and gaining resources that allow other family members, often the more vulnerable, to follow suit. Given the immense wave of immigration that surfaced during the brief window between World War I's end and the imposition of restriction in 1921, there is every reason to think that family reunification would have impelled countless others to head for the United States had doors remained open. Indeed, the fact that as early as 1931, waiting lists of immigrants seeking admission to the United States extended far beyond the backlogs experienced by Mexican and Filipino brothers and sisters of US citizens today, and currently judged intolerable, suggests how intense was the demand for family reunification on both sides of the Atlantic. Decades later, those family ties had still not been sundered. As of early 1961, Maddalena tells us, there were over 171,000 pending family reunion applications, of which 80% were from Italians. Now, first and second generation Jews and Italians of the times were neither disconnected from their compatriots nor indifferent to their fate. Migration to the US may have largely stopped in 1924, but not travel, with return visits a regularity until the onset of the Depression. The vast foreign language press acutely and keenly covered homeland events. And now huge literature has arisen to analyze contemporary immigrant hometown associations and the impact of their activities on the communities left behind. But in historical comparison, the cross-border efforts of today pale in light of the efforts made during the period with which Maddalena is concerned. Between 1919 and 1924 alone, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee raised over $1 billion measured in today's currency for relief projects in Eastern Europe. By contrast, collective remittances to Mexico total roughly 80 million. Individual hometown associations bringing together still recently arrived immigrants supplemented these efforts. Jewish hometown associations sent over 500 representatives to Eastern Europe in the early 1920s to distribute relief funds. And later, despite the strains caused by the Great Depression, the subsequent rise of Nazism, and the intensification of anti-Semitism in Poland led to a subsequent burst of activity, with significant flows of relief, again heading back to Europe. Now, the conventional analysis, it seems to me, complacently assumes that the Southern and Eastern European immigrants and their descendants gained a bedrock of acceptance. But the immigrants themselves saw it differently. As David Fitzgerald and David Cook Martin have argued in their book, Culling the Masses, restriction for countries of emigration, restriction on the basis of national origins, entailed the experience of national humiliation. Yet far deeper, it seems to me, was the humiliation of the immigrants against whom those restrictions were directed. As Maddalena correctly notes, and now I quote, the descendants of Southern and Eastern European immigrants believed that retaining the quota system unchanged reaffirmed their inferiority, undermined their status in US society, and denied the progress they had made. And yet, to grasp the full import of restriction and the exceptional degree of coercion that it entailed, one has to go beyond the ambit of the domestic arena. And here, I believe, lies one of the few shortcomings of Maddalena's book. The book is caught, I think, in a core tension. On the one hand, its concern is with policies that are inherently international. On the other hand, the focus is on the mobilization of domestic groups engaged in interest group politics. And yet, precisely for that reason, the global context falls out of view. Now, the bulk of the scholarship views the advent of restriction in the mid-1920s with a certain degree of complacency. The assumption is that the pre-existing world of mass migration was inherently coming to an end. But reality is actually quite different. When the US closed its gates, Europe was in the midst of a severe refugee crisis. In the aftermath of World War I, roughly 10 million Europeans were homeless, having been forced to flee by war, revolution, and ethnic cleansing. When the dust settled, there were more than 1 million refugees bottled up in Europe, the single largest fraction of whom had fled the Russian Revolution and ensuing civil war, a conflict that the US itself had intensified with both troops and funds in support of the counter-revolution. Were it not for restriction, a significant portion of those refugees would undoubtedly have crossed the Atlantic. Now, contrary to the conventional wisdom, labor migration didn't suddenly disappear with the closure of US doors. While Italian emigration ebbed after the zeniths recorded at the turn of the 20th century, the decline nonetheless took it to levels that remain high by any normal ranking. In the roughly 30 years between the onset of the First World War and the end of the Second, almost 4 million immigrants left Italy, making for an emigration rate of 3.7 per thousand, which is what is recorded today by Somalia, and well above the rate for countries such as the Dominican Republic, Armenia, or Haiti, all considered conventionally high immigration states. In Eastern Europe, Jews also left when they could. Historians estimate that several 100,000 Jews left Eastern Europe, with significant growth of Jewish communities throughout Latin America and South Africa, as well as distant Manchuria. Of course, the pressure to flee intensified with the Nazi seizure of power, a refugee crisis which Maddalena ably sketches. As she notes, the pressures against expanded refugee admissions were intense. An anti-Semitic public, State Department officials intent on using every measure possible to keep numbers, to block immigrant admissions, and legislators far more eager to push immigrant numbers down rather than up, awareness of which bred a great deal of hesitancy among Jewish immigration advocates. Maddalena points out that admissions did gradually grow, up from 8,220 in 1933 to almost 30,000 in 1939 and 1940, the only years when the German quotas were largely filled. But nonetheless, global perspective shows how successfully the US kept itself beyond reach. Between 1933 and 1941, almost 500,000 Jews escaped the Greater German Reich, with the US providing a haven to roughly a fifth. Latin America, which historically had been a minor destination for Jewish immigration, took in almost as many Jewish refugees as the United States. And while calculated as a ratio of refugees admitted per thousand in the population, the US record of 0.7 per thousand appears particularly appalling, as opposed to over 3 per thousand for Argentina, which admitted 45,000 Jews, so almost as many as half the US total, or 1.1 for the UK, with an inflow of 52,000. Nor does the post-World War II record look better when examined in global perspective. As we heard from David Nasso 2 weeks ago, the resistance to refugee resettlement in Congress and among the general public was not only intense, but once it was overcome, it allowed for the entry of people who were largely impelled by economic motives, not persecution, and among whom the survivors of the Holocaust were relatively poorly represented. Even so, the US, which had a thriving economy, did barely better than badly battered Britain, with an economy on life support. The Brits resettled 1.8 refugees per thousand, as opposed to the US 2.1 per thousand. And though Canada and Australia were both impelled by a perceived need for people, these countries' experience, with Canada admitting 8 refugees per 1,000 and Australia admitting 20 per 1,000, demonstrates how begrudgingly the US opened refugee doors. In the Italian case, emigration began almost immediately after hostilities ended, seeing emigration as an essential to recovery from wartime devastation. Italian government signed guest worker agreements whenever the opportunity arrived. Now, just whether post-war migration should be considered as an economic or refugee migration is a matter of nuance. Italians departing lost colonies, as well as those who suffered ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe, descended on the peninsula, which also underwent extensive wartime-induced internal migration. From the standpoint of the Western powers, however, the refugee problem was located in Germany, not Italy, which is why Italians were virtually excluded from the first wave of refugee resettlement. Now, regardless of the motivations that led people to depart, the post-war period again saw sizable emigration. 7 million people left Italy between 1945 and 1975 for an annual emigration rate of 4.9 per 1,000, which is exactly comparable to El Salvador today. Now, some of those immigrants did make it to the United States, in part thanks to mid-1950s legislation that used the refugee label to legitimize the entry of persons who were possibly displaced, but surely not facing persecution, and various other workarounds that diminished the bite of restriction. Thus, as Maddalena notes, while the quota system lived on until the mid-1960s, it did so with diminishing effectiveness, as indicated by the arrival of almost 200,000 Italian immigrants, way above what quotas would have allowed. Yet, when the American experience is evaluated in light of the overall global flows, what strikes me is the severity of the constraints. Of those 7 million post-war Italian immigrants, fewer than 10% ever managed to make it onto US soil. Now, Maddalena's book also offers us the opportunity to reassess the oppositions between, quote, now and, quote, then, of which so many migration scholars, though perhaps less so among historians and sociologists or anthropologists or political scientists, are so fond. Now, 1965 supposedly inaugurated a new era of immigration. And yet, as Maddalena very correctly points out, immigration immediately resumed after World War II, despite all the barriers put in place by restrictionist legislation. Immigration then followed a steady upward climb, doing so at a pace that didn't change after 1965. So was there ever really a, quote, new immigration, as so many of us, yours truly included, have insisted? Similarly, the vast literature on transnationalism began with the claim that the late 20th century witnessed an unprecedented shift in immigrants' connection with their homeland. But as Maddalena demonstrates, Italians and Jews were consistently concerned with the fate of their compatriots abroad. In an important sub-theme of the book, one which I haven't had time to discuss, Maddalena shows the ways in which the Italian state sought to influence both US policy involving migration and Italian Americans, and in doing so in ways that clearly foreshadowed the diaspora policies that have emerged in recent years. Likewise, many of us have rightfully railed against the rising tide of nativism and its terribly noxious impact over the past 4 years. But as I suggested in my opening remarks, the look backwards can provide us with significant cause for comfort. No small fraction of Americans today are xenophobic, but in relative terms, far fewer and with less virulence than was the case during the years on which Maddalena focuses. And now, unlike then, there is a xenophile for every xenophobe, which is why the new administration has just announced an immigration policy massively more far-reaching than any measure contemplated during the period that Maddalena discusses. But it does seem to me that there is one now-then difference that clearly emerges from Maddalena's book, albeit with the dividing line appearing not in 1965, but a century ago. And it was then, at that moment, that we definitively passed from a world of relatively open borders to a world governed by a new 11th commandment, which reads, "Thou shalt not cross state boundaries without authorization." Alas, that 11th commandment rules in a world in which the gains to migration, always great, are significantly larger than they were a century ago. And hence, despite the good feeling engendered by Wednesday's change in administration, we need to be ready for troubled times, as the clash between states' efforts to control borders and migrants' efforts to cross borders simply in order to better their lives will make for continuing conflict and controversy. And as we think about the conflict and controversy about to come, Maddalena's book will continue to generate light that will allow us to understand the events that are about to hit us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. Maddalena, would you like to take, say, 3 or 5 minutes to respond to all of Roger's comments?
Yes. How about 3 minutes? Well, first of all, thank you. I could not have talked about my book better than he did, so this is amazing. But there are 3 things that stood out. Roger identified, I think, the biggest weakness of my book. At one of these events, someone asked me whether I wrote the book that I wanted. And my biggest regret is not to place this story in a more transnational global view. That lens was much more there when it was a dissertation, but the transition to a book so that diminished in part because I thought that it was important to pay attention to some of the dynamics in Congress. And I was really, in doing that, I was trying to understand the disconnect between how Euro-American activists essentially are presented in some of the literature and the constraints and the pressures they personally felt, right? So it's a matter of how we see what was happening and how they felt their role in as Roger said, in a very hostile, anti-immigrant and xenophobic society, essentially. So I totally understand that criticism, and I did my best to keep it in there, but clearly once you have a global perspective, the story of the United States becomes even more problematic during this period, especially for a country that continues to present itself as a nation of immigrants. I also wanted to note that what I found particularly striking, and again, it goes against some of the assumptions about the activism of this group, is that Jewish activists, for example, continued to fight for immigration reform, even though they knew after the 50s and 60s that the reforms that they were fighting for wouldn't necessarily end up benefiting the group, other Jewish immigrants, especially those behind the Iron Curtain, right? And I think if you keep that in mind, then their efforts also gain a different meaning. I also wanted to, that's when I wish I were a sociologist. Thank you for all the numbers, Roger, because they're striking. I think one of the things that I tried to show that is that the scale of the opposition, right, was much larger than today, even though it feels worse today because we're living through it. But one other thing that I wish I had developed more, and that Roger's comments reminded me of, is the labels, the names that we have when we apply to people who move, right? We're refugees, all the refugees strictly identify themselves as refugees, are migrants, people who move exclusively for economic reasons. And so I really appreciated Roger's discussion when it came to that, because I think it behooves us to question some of the terminology. Like, one of the things that stood out to me is how these groups were thinking about skilled versus unskilled, right? Because even they at the time were making an argument that we hear fairly regularly today. It's like, unskilled is a way of diminishing what these immigrants are able to do. I always tell my students, if you put me in a field, I don't know what to do, or right? And so why are we using these labels? And then, yes, I wanted to echo that what I find interesting, that even during this period of so-called the golden era of restriction that a lot of restrictionists want to go back to, labor migration continued. It practically never stopped. And in fact, in a way, precisely because immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe was diminished, it meant that American employers looked elsewhere, right? Especially within the Americans. Anyway, I'll stop at that because I know I could see that we have a few questions and I want to give everyone an opportunity to ask them.
Yes, so we've had up to 90 people on the call. There's a lot of interest in your work. And you're welcome to type your question into the Q&A, or if you use the hand raising function, we will just admit you into the room to ask directly. So our first question comes from Irene Bloomrad from Berkeley Sociology.
I wasn't expecting to be let into the room, so sorry.
You're in the
Hi,
room.
Maddalena.
Hi.
That was unanticipated, but it's nice to see you in person. So my question was about how to understand the politics and advocacy of this time. You use the word activist frequently, and I personally am delighted to know more about this period because I totally agree with you that it's been understudied, especially in terms of the politics on immigration restriction. But I'm interested in knowing whether what distinction you might see, if any, between understanding political activism as social movement activism or sort of more elite-led political lobbying. And when I think about the present day, sort of echoing Roger's comments, you know, the social movement activism, the protests in the street, those things have been really important for the Dreamers, or even back in 2006 with the millions of people in the streets. And my sense is, I've only gotten a third through your book, but my sense is that it's a little bit maybe what people would call standard ethnic politics or sort of behind the scenes lobbying. And I don't know if there's more of a public dimension to it. And I'd love to hear you talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so there's a bit of a tension. So I would say that it starts off in the streets with protests and massive letter writing campaigns. But by the beginning of the 20th century, both groups decide I think it's also a matter of respectability, right? They think that they have to have a formal organization that represents them in Congress. But that until the 50s, that will always be a huge source of tension because these elite men, and they're almost entirely men, essentially end up being far more moderate than the grassroots would want them to be. And they say that it's because of the legislative political constraints, right? It's the system, but it's also the people that they're dealing with. And it's really not until the 50s that this kind of elite group realizes that there's actually a way to use that energy, right? That frustration. And so one of the Italians finally organize an organization, and they in the 1950s. And the first thing they do is that they go into the local communities and say, write to your representatives, something that they had done at the end of the 19th century, but almost completely disappears. And it doesn't emerge again until the 1950s. And I think they feel more comfortable with it because that's becoming the norm to fight for change across the United States. So civil rights activists are doing that, women's rights activists are doing that. But even then, they don't necessarily agree on the end goal, right? Especially the younger the activists, the more frustrated they are with the old generation that believes that you have to do everything behind closed door and that you have to use diplomacy. It's like, no, we should take the street and we should. So the term that I talked about in the 50s from going to let's take down the quota system to let's work piecemeal ends up being a huge disappointment for activists. And they see that as a defeat, essentially. I hope that answered that question. Thank you. Great to see you. Thank you for being here.
Philip Hoffer.
I'm sorry, I asked the question, what were the particular groups? And I was particularly interested in the Italians. Who did they coalesce around, or what did they coalesce around in terms of their activism, please?
Thank you. Jewish activists essentially coalesce around the American Jewish community. They become, in terms of political lobbying, at the forefront of this efforts. For Italians, the story is a little bit more complicated, in part because, especially in the first 30 years of the 20th century, they can't agree on a common identity. So the main organization is Osaya, so the Order Sons of Italy in America. Today they're called Order Sons and Daughters of Italy in America. But in a way, that organization is not as effective because they try to do, so the American Jewish community is very much focused on lobbying for policy change. Osaya thinks that it needs to create a common identity. It needs to lobby for policy changes, and it needs to create, it needs to focus on presenting a positive image of Italian. So it's stretched really thin. And it's not until 1952, in part because of the Catholic Church, that these elite Italian Americans create yet another organization. It's called ACIM, American Committee on Italian Migration, which really becomes the Italian equivalent of the American Jewish community. So they focus exclusively on immigration, and they're essentially a lobbying army. They also work on resettlement, but they kind of outsource that to other Catholic organizations that can help with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Then let me just summarize a couple of questions, one from Mary Kant and one from Perry Bloom, about why Italian and Jewish immigrants weren't wanted in the first place. They list some specific reasons, and one of the issues that I would like you to address is the extent to which the science of eugenics and social Darwinism affected those early efforts at restriction from the 1890s up to the Quota Acts.
Yeah, so they actually play a big role, essentially, right? So there's a very much a race talk, right? These people will dilute the American race. They're also, because they're of an inferior stock, they will be harder to assimilate, Americanize, and because they don't come from a democratic tradition, they risk endangering the American Republic. But I have to say that there were two arguments that helped restrictionists succeed. One is they systematically, by the beginning of the 20th century, they systematically start making comparisons between Italian Jewish immigrants and especially Chinese immigrants. So Italians, for example, were often called the Chinese of Europe, and Jewish immigrants were often credited with having Oriental features. And then, now I forgot the other one. Sorry. And then the other piece that helped is it's not by chance that the first truly restrictive measure that they successfully adopted against these two groups is a literacy test. And the idea came from using the literacy test in the US South, essentially, against the African Americans. And so there's an effort to equate these groups to other immigrants of colors, right? But also domestic minoritized people of color. And so social Darwinism and eugenics are all part of these conversations, but it's really this two ideas that you can see determine a shift among a lot of legislators who until the 1910s felt really uncomfortable specifically restricting European immigrants.
Thanks. We have a question from Rucha Deshpande. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name.
No worries, that was really close. Thank you so much, Dr. Marinari, for your talk. I'm actually an undergraduate student in Professor Waldinger's class, and so I've gone to read the introduction of your book, but I was just curious to hear more about what the transition period was like in the United States. post-World War II regarding immigration policy reform. Did the government take any measures to change public perceptions of immigrant communities, or were changes mostly made on purely a policy level?
Thank you for that great question. So did the government make an effort? Yes and no. So one of the things that the government realizes after World War II is that once you promise to bring more people, someone has to move these people, right? And so one of the things that Truman did, essentially, it ended into a partnership with a local organization to move and assist incoming displaced persons, incoming immigrants, and incoming refugees. And so it's actually these organizations that then launch quote unquote education campaigns. And if you look at some of the newsletters that they published, there's a very clear narrative. They always have families. They always have, and they're, they magically get off the boat and they look stunning, right? They look rested and they look well dressed. So clearly some of this was staged. And so the government didn't actively participate in that, in part because so much of this policy comes from Democrats, but Democrats are actually quite divided. So the person I mentioned earlier, McCarran, he absolutely hated that the United States passed the the Displaced Persons Act, right? And he criticized, especially Jewish activists, for making that happen. And that's why he takes kind of a revenge in 1952 when he says, I will pass a law that will reinforce the quota system and mark you as undesirable one more time, right? But that's an important moment. So the government is not very active. The only piece that they're a bit more engaged in is to justify how they went from a complete ban on Asian immigration to having these teeny tiny quotas and eliminating the racial requirement, right? And they frame that exclusively in Cold War terms, essentially. I hope that answered the question.
That did, yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So getting back to the question of what were the origins of these kinds of discrimination, we have a question from Professor David Abraham. Given the supposed proclivity of Jewish and Italian immigrants to engage in leftist politics and union activism, how close was the tie between restrictionism and anti-labor mobilization?
Well, it was definitely there, but I mean, and labor unions in particular are organized these massive labor writing campaigns targeting these leftist immigrants, essentially. It's actually the immigration restriction that I mentioned at the beginning that intentionally courts these different groups in order to create a nationwide coalition of people that can collectively push for immigration restriction. And so they target politicians in the West, right? They target politicians in the South, but outside the chambers of Congress, they particularly court labor activists, essentially, labor unions. And it's that alliance that I think makes a lot of the stereotypes and criticism against these two groups really mainstream, because a lot of the letters that they sent to it was clearly a very coordinated effort, because a lot of the letters that they sent to these legislators have they're practically all using the same language, right? They're not just stealing jobs, but they're also bringing subversive ideology into the country.
Okay, a quick empirical question from Donna Gabacha. Did the looming quota laws not produce an upward bump in Italian naturalization? Only a US passport could have allowed them to continue their transnational visits and circulations.
Yes, so one of the unintended consequences, which I think the legislators did not anticipate, is that the more restrictions were passed, the more Italians naturalized and tried to bring family members over. But that then ran into problems once Mussolini got to power, and he changed his approach to his policy, right? At first he was in favor of immigration, and then he wasn't. And in this case, it mattered whether the person with the passport was a man or a woman. So it was, women were often denied by the Italian government the possibility of reuniting with their family. But yes, one of the unintended consequences of restrictions is that many more Italians became US citizens and ended up sending for their families. Hi, Donna. Thank you for being here.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from Victor.
Okay, what I would like to know, one question was, I'd heard that 1/3 of the immigrants between the 1890s and the early 1920s actually returned home or to other countries. Have you looked into that?
So Italians had the highest return migration rate, essentially. More than half returned to Italy, essentially, or migrated elsewhere. That percentage, up until recently, we thought that essentially no Jewish immigrants had returned, but that was not the case. There is some estimate that about between 3 and 7% of Jewish immigrants left as well, in part because of the climate that they were living in the United States, and I guess the misalignment between the expectations of being part of US society and the reality that they met once they arrived.
And Victor, you had a second question?
Yeah, in the late 1930s, early 1940s, had a very anti-Semitic State Department. People like Breckinridge Long.
Yeah.
What was the impact?
The most immediate impact, and I think Roger mentioned in his remarks as well, was that for most of the 1930s, the German quota went unfilled, right? And that was not by chance, right? So despite the fact that there were a lot of German Jews who would have liked to leave Germany, because of the anti-Semitism of a lot of officers in the State Department, these people were not granted visas, for example. And so there's also a lot of, there are no evidence, but apparently the State Department also issued memos that said to essentially raise the bar when it came to certain applicants, which is particularly striking because, again, Germany had the highest yearly quota, and despite that, it went unfilled for most of the decade. And the answer to why that was is you get it only if you look at what was going on in the State Department and the anti-Semitism, essentially, of a lot of these officers who simply did not grant these quotas, essentially.
Okay, next there's a question from Federico Trudo.
Yes, hello Maddalena. Congratulazioni per il libro, sono italiano anch'io. So you write about the many Italians who moved to the United States and then returned back to their home country, in contrast to Jews. Do you think that the discrimination that they faced in the US in the first decades of the 20th century, both de jure and de facto, left a legacy on the anti-immigration stance shared by Italians today? So, shouldn't Italians as a nation of immigrants have a historical sense of duty towards the people who are crossing the Mediterranean Sea today?
Yes. I think Italians have a really interesting relationship with the history of migration, right? There's even a book that says "Quando gli Albanesi eravamo noi," right? When we were the Albanians, right? Trying to get attention to that history. But I think this is a case of big historical amnesia, where Italians essentially don't recognize that they're doing and saying things that are very similar to the experiences that Italian migrants had a century ago, essentially. it seems that there is some movement for change, thanks to some scholars in the United States. For example, Italians are finally paying attention to Italians of color, which you haven't really been seen discussed the way that they are right now. There's also a push to change citizenship laws because you have so many people who were born here that in Italy, sorry, who can't get citizenship until they're 18. And so I think there is some movement, but I don't think that Italians have fully recognized this history, essentially.
Okay, thank you very much.
Grazie, Federico.
Grazie.
All right, our final question goes to Jesse Garskoff.
Hi, Maddalena. Thanks for this wonderful presentation and for the great work. I have a question that sort of goes back to the question that Roger raised about the relationship to whiteness of these groups. And I'm also thinking about Lily Garland's critique of Jewish activism as being in some ways as divorcing the question of their own group's migration from the other groups that are around. And so I was wondering, given that there were actually other groups that were targeted in the same period, so obviously Chinese exclusion and inadmissibility of citizenship, but also the really profound impact on Black West Indian migration of the 1924 restrictions, and then of course the Box Commission in 1929 trying to extend restriction to Mexicans. I'm wondering whether Jewish and Italian advocates in this period were aware of those impacts and effects, and whether they were interested in them or not.
That's an excellent question, and one that I went into the archives with, honestly. So I can tell you that both groups were very, very interested in what Chinese activists were doing. And so, for example, there is this memo at the end of the 19th century that says we should really be doing what we should have a Chinese approach to the courts, right? And so they go to court. Why are we doing the same, especially when it came to labor rights? But they quickly realized that that's not effective, right? Again, a lot of members of the American Jewish Committee, they were lawyers, and they actually fought against Chinese exclusion because they worried about the ramifications of, excluding a group specifically for racial purposes. So interestingly, while they were paying attention, interested in, and they were sympathizing with what was going on with Asian immigrants. So this is 1910s, 1920s, right? They were not as understanding of what was going on when it came to migration in North America, for example. So it's really fascinating because the same lawyers who went to court to challenge Chinese exclusion also wrote letters that said, how can you put us on par with Mexican immigrants? Right. So I think there's a whole other book that needs to be written about that. So it's and I really tried to say how did they rationalize these things, right? But I was never able to find that much evidence. But it is something that I try intentionally to bring into the book, although it's not fully developed. But clearly, these are aspects. They're trying to navigate their own identity by comparing and contrasting themselves to the other groups. So, I know that some of them were frustrated that when they crossed the borders, right, they were sometimes mistaken for Mexican migrants, and I wonder if that has to do something with it. But that is the extent. That is what I know. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying more about that. But the discrepancy between how they regarded these two groups is really fascinating. Thank you, Jesse.
And thank you, Maddalena and Roger, for sharing your expertise. It's an extremely rich text. We look forward to hosting you back when you have finished your next book project. Not to put any pressure on you, but we know it's coming soon. Also coming soon, next Friday at noon Pacific, we will be continuing our series of emerging scholar workshops. We have scholars based in Australia, Peru, and the United States who are going to be discussing various aspects of asylum, You can get the information about that workshop as well as the registration in order to be able to access the papers and read them in advance. It's a discussion-based workshop rather than long presentations by the authors. So we very much hope to see you again next Friday, and have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye.